how do telescopes work? And for that matter, how do lenses work when we point them at stars to take pictures of the Milky Way, nebulae, galaxies, etc.? This seems like a simple enough question with hopefully simple enough answers. And yet, the fact of the matter is, even in communities like amateur astrophotographers, there are a lot of misconceptions floating around about how telescopes work, how they get the light from those distant stars and nebulae, and how they focus it on your sensor. And in this video, we're going to use some optics simulation software to show you exactly how it works. And we'll look at how the light from distant stars gets to us, how lenses in our eyes, for instance, or in telescopes can capture that light and focus it onto a sensor, how it works for multiple stars in your field of view, what the impact of focal reducers or focal extenders is, whether lens hoods can impact your image, and we'll look at that with both kind of an ideal type of telescope design and telescope lens, but also through different telescope designs and also with a real-life kind of lens made of glass that does not focus things perfectly. Oh, and by the way, this video is sponsored by Brilliant.org, more later in the video. We first need to start with how do photons, or we can model them as light rays, come from distant stars to us. So for that, we need to imagine a star floating in space, whether it's our sun or another star, and it's basically a ball of plasma. And at any moment in time, it is emitted a lot of energy, and some of that energy is light energy, photons basically. So you can imagine the star at any moment in time will emit a certain quantity of photons all around it, so 360 degrees, and we can imagine those photons that have been emitted at the same time expanding as a sphere that gets away from that star in all directions, and that sphere expands at the speed of light. If there's no obstacles at all between that star and, let's say, my eye here on planet Earth, then at some point the sphere will have expanded enough that a very small, tiny fraction of that sphere will be reaching my eye. And by the time that happens, the sphere's diameter is at least 4.3 light years large, if we're not talking about the sun. And so because that sphere is so large, for us, that sphere only appears as a flat surface that is just rushing into my eyes. Completely flat surface, right? Just like when you're standing on the surface of the Earth, it doesn't matter that the Earth is more or less a sphere. To me, it looks flat, right, from my reference point of view. Same thing for that gigantic sphere that is expanding and that contains all of the photons emitted by that distant star at a given moment in time. And because of that, all of those photons, from my point of view, they're just like a wall of photons that just like reaches planet Earth, like a wall, a flat, almost like completely flat wall, reaches planet Earth, and all of those photons, for all intents and purposes, they look like they're coming from exactly the same direction. They're all parallel to one another. All of those light rays that are approaching as this crazy wall towards Earth are parallel to one another. And it so happens that some of those light rays, our eye, for instance, our pupil, if we're young, it might be as much as 7 millimeters diameter, will capture some of those light rays. But something like this lens here, which is actually an objective lens for a telescope, it's larger than my eye, kind of obviously. So it will be able to capture more of those photons from that wall that reaches it. And the larger that lens, the more photons it is able to capture and then focus somewhere. So the more useful light we have. And that's why in astrophotography, we talk about aperture as typically the diameter of that objective lens that we use for our telescope, because the larger that diameter, the more the surface area of that lens is, and therefore the more of the light energy that was emitted by that faraway star we can capture. Because even assuming we lost no energy at all of the photons made it all the way here with nothing lost, because it's an expanding sphere of energy, all of that light, all of those photons that were emitted by the star at a moment in time is getting spread across that whole sphere. And so because the surface area of a sphere is, I think, 4 pi r square, the light energy or the photons that actually reach this particular lens here is proportional to the square of the distance from that star to us. And now I'm going to talk about a given star, okay? This star is emitting light, it's hitting us like a wall, like a continuous wall of photons. All of the light rays look like they're parallel to one another, and we're looking straight at that star. That means that in my eye, that my little lens in the eye, it's getting all of those light rays. They're all parallel to one another, and they're also perpendicular to my lens in the eye. So we are receiving all of those light rays at a 90 degrees angle to my lens in the eye. What about if I'm looking straight at a star? Let's say I'm looking at the star Vega in the night sky in summer, and then like somewhere around here in my field of view, like I can still see it, but there's another star. Let's say Deneb is there. The star Deneb is there from Cygnus, and Deneb also is emitting. It has like its expanding sphere of photons that reaches us like a wall, except that in this case, while the wall coming from the first star is hitting my eye straight on, the eye from Deneb is actually hitting my eye at an angle, right? Because I'm not looking directly at Deneb. This is something that is very relevant for telescopes, and it will clear up a very common misconception that I've seen. So if we have two stars in my field of view, one star I'm looking directly at, another star is kind of like in the corner of my vision, it means that the parallel light rays from the first star are hitting me straight on at a 90 degrees angle. The parallel light rays from the second star is hitting me at an angle. The parallel light rays from each star are parallel to one another, but both stars' parallel light rays are not parallel to one another, if that makes sense. With that in mind, we can go to the optics simulation software to see how this would work for a telescope, or even for our eye, because our eye is effectively a tiny telescope. Okay, so the simplest way to look at things is, first we can model our star, right? Our star, it's a point of light that is infinitely far away, and as we understood earlier, from our point of view, because it is so far away, it just looks like a wall of photons that hits us, and we can simulate that as light rays that are all parallel to one another. So in here, I can create that as a beam of light rays like that. This is the light coming from a star. And if we have another star that is at a completely different angle from this first star, we can also model it as a beam of parallel light rays like this. Those are basically models of two stars. One is blasting us with parallel light rays in one direction. The other one is blasting us with parallel light rays coming from another direction. Okay, so now the goal is to catch those light rays. The more light rays we catch, the more light energy we've managed to get. So we can use a lens. So I'm going to take a lens, and we're going to take an ideal lens. Let's say I put an ideal lens here. Boop. Now we have an ideal lens, and I can even increase its focal length, something like that, so we can see what happens. And now I am going to just restrict the light beams here to the area that covers the lens, something like this. So this represents the portion of this wall of photons hitting us that has been captured by this particular lens for those two stars. I'm going to remove the brightness, completely zero out the brightness of one of those stars. That way we can see what a single star does and go into the first misconception. So that lens here, this ideal lens, which by the way, we're looking at it from the side. So if I take that lens here, this diagram is working as we're looking straight on to the side of the lens, and we have the light rays that are hitting that lens like this. Directly, like 1, 2, 3, they're all hitting the lens and then getting focused on the other side. We're looking at the side of the lens. It's like a side view that we have cut effectively. So now we have the star that has all of its light rays hitting our lens at a 90-degree angle. It's perfectly square to our lens. And you can see that all of those light beams, they get focused at one point here. So if I were to put a sensor there, let's block the light and just say like, okay, I have a camera sensor here. And that camera sensor is intercepting all of those light rays where they become exactly a dot, which is perfect because a star is so far away that from our point of view, when we look at it, it's just a dot, right? You see a twinkling dot in the sky, that's a star. The twinkle is just the atmosphere kind of messing with the photons coming from that star. And then when you see it, when it gets projected onto your retina, it's just a point of light, and we see it as a point of light. So if we want to represent this star with the sensor in a focused way, in exactly the same way that we see it with our eyes, we need to place that camera sensor exactly where the focus point of that lens is, and therefore where that star becomes a point of light. And this is where the biggest misconception that I've seen comes. Like a lot of amateur astrophotographers, they think that these parallel light rays that hit the lens encompass the whole field of view that we are able to image with our sensor. And therefore, when I place the sensor here, you can see that all of those light rays, they come up to a single point of the sensor. And so we're just having a single dot of light. And so if we have multiple stars in our field of view, if we have nebulae in our field of view, etc., it all gets diluted into a single dot. Therefore, this doesn't work. We cannot place the sensor there, and therefore the sensor has to be here. And you can see now we have parallel those light rays that cover the whole sensor, and now we are finally getting an image of the whole field of view. That is how it works. This is wrong. This is very misleading, very wrong, and I have seen that in other videos. What we are representing here is simply a star being out of focus. So if I have my sensor here, the star is in focus, we have a single dot at the center of the sensor. If I have my sensor here, that single star is now out of focus, and it is now actually just a disk of light, an out of focus disk of light. And same thing, if I go to the other side of the focus point, that star is now just a disk of light. And that's why those out of focus stars in a refractor or in a camera lens, even when you look at scenes in movies where the focus is on the face of a person and there are distant lights, then those lights will appear as disks because they're out of focus compared to the main subject of the image. So we can go back to the previous explanation of how if I'm looking directly at a star, if there's another star in my field of view, it also emits parallel light rays, except that they come from another direction. And now we can turn on our second star. So I'm going to put the brightness to the same as the first one. And poof, we can see we have a second star that is a set of parallel light rays that hits the lens at an angle. And you can see it gets focused also on the sensor, but at a different spot. So there we go. We have those two stars, one dot here, a second dot here, and they have been perfectly focused on the sensor. We have exactly what we want. The two stars are represented as two separate dots on the sensor. And I can even add a third star on the opposite end of the sensor, something like, let's say this. And now you can see we have a third star and it gets focused on the sensor as a third point of light. 3 stars, 3 points of light, it all makes sense. Now what happens if I take my lens and I change the focal length of my lens? We have already understood that the larger the lens is, the more of those light rays it can capture, and therefore the more light it can focus onto our sensor. That makes sense. What if we change the focal length, where that focal point of the lens here? So remember, these 3 stars, they basically cover almost the whole sensor. So now I'm going to change the focal length of my lens. It is 380, let's say, millimeters right now. Let's put it to, 644. That's fine. Now let me take my sensor here and put it at the focal point of one of the stars, and we can notice immediately something weird is going on. My sensor, it sees the first star at the very center of the sensor, but it's no longer large enough to capture the other 2 stars. What this means is effectively we've zoomed in, because if we zoom in, obviously, stars, as you zoom in, 2 stars that were close to one another, they become further and further away from one another as we zoom into the center star. At some point, the stars that are going further and further away from one another, they will just exit our field of view as we get closer and closer to the star in the middle. That is exactly what is happening here. 2 solutions. Either we change the focal length, or we simply make the sensor larger, like here. Now we have a larger sensor. We're still able to capture all of those 3 stars, but we are having those 3 stars on a larger surface area. We have zoomed in a lot. And the reverse is true if I go back to something 200 millimeters, which was much less than before. Now, the 3 stars are much closer to one another on the sensor. We've zoomed out. And actually, we could even have like a star that comes from an even further away direction. Now we're able to capture the light of a star that comes at an angle that's almost like, 45 degrees? Not 45 degrees, but you can see it's quite an angle. We're able to capture that star with our sensor. So it is very wrong to think of, our telescope just having parallel light rays hitting it at a 90 degrees angle. It also has those parallel light rays from multiple stars in the field of view hitting our main objective lens here at an angle. And those stars get put onto the camera sensor. The shorter the focal length is, the more the stars are grouped with one another and the larger the field of view we have for the same sensor. The longer the focal length is, the more we zoom in, and therefore, like stars that are not at the center will just draw further and further apart until they are outside of the sensor as we zoom in more and more. And this is extremely important because what's going to happen then is that as we zoom in, we spread out the light that comes from stuff like nebulae. And we can represent that fairly easily. Imagine you have two stars. Okay, we've imaged those two stars exactly as we've shown on the diagram earlier. We have those two stars, and with our current focal length on the sensor, this square here is, let's say, our sensor. Those two stars, they're at this distance from one another. And let's say right between those two stars, we have an area of nebulosity here in between the two stars in orange. All of that is an area of nebulosity. And let's say that for the size of our lens, this area of luminosity across the whole area, we get on average 1,000 photons per second across the whole area. Let's say our camera sensor has huge pixels, and right now with this nebula in between those two stars and those 1,000 photons per second that we get across this area, let's say that this whole area is covered by 4 pixels. So here we have the dark lines or the grid of pixels. So we have pixel 1 here, pixel 2, pixel 3, pixel 4. It just means that each of the pixels is getting 250 photons per second because the whole area is 1,000 photons per second. And that also means that if part of the nebula was actually slightly brighter or less bright than the other parts of the nebula, let's say we represent that by colors like this. Actually, like the nebula like that, this part was roughly 200 photons per second. That part was 300 photons per second. The two other were 250 photons per second. Now, because we have our pixels covering all of those parts of the nebula, each of those pixels is able to see the difference in luminosity. So we are able to capture this detail here. What happens if we zoom out? Now we've zoomed out and you can see we have still the two stars. One is here, one is there, but we're now zooming in out quite a lot, so they're much closer to one another, and this area of nebulosity that gives us overall 1,000 photons per second with our lens size is now much smaller. So now it would fall onto, let's say, a single pixel. So because of that single pixel is receiving the whole 1,000 photons per second compared to the previous scenario where each pixel was only receiving between 200 and 300 photons per second. So we have a better per pixel signal to noise ratio. We're receiving more signal every second. That's awesome. But at the same time, remember those areas of nebulosity that were slightly different, like one had 300 photons per second, the other had 200 photons per second, the last two had 250 photons per second. Well, we're losing that because now we are amalgamating everything into a single pixel, and therefore we can only see the average value of 1,000 photons per second. We have a constant luminosity. We are losing details, but we are gaining signal to noise ratio per pixel. That's what the focal length does. And what the aperture, the size of your lens, does is figure out how many of those photons you capture in the first place. So the larger the lens you have, if you had a lens that was, let's say, this lens captured those 1,000 photons per second for that nebula, if I doubled the surface area of this lens, then I would have received 2,000 photons per second for that nebula. Okay, I also want to talk about how focal extenders reducers work. But first, if you feel a bit lost and you feel that you need to kind of refresh your knowledge on physics, math, computer science, etc. to kind of catch up to this explanation, well, there's a great way to do that, and that is to use today's video sponsor, Brilliant.org. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in math, data analysis, programming, and AI. And of course, all of that can build the foundation to better understand so many topics in our hobby of astrophotography. And I think it is one of the most effective ways to learn, because each lesson is filled with hands-on problems that you actually need to solve on the spot to really integrate and understand what is being told, which is so much more effective than just like watching a video, for instance. And those lessons, they're bite-sized, they're easy to fit into your schedule, so it makes it very easy to develop a powerful daily learning habit and also to learn on the go. If you just have your phone with you, it's available there and you can get to it, and it is actually a lot of fun. There are tons of lessons available from data, programming, math, and other topics as well. And I find math particularly useful for our hobby. And with Brilliant's approach, you can build and use formulas to solve real-world problems and at the same time enhance your visual and spatial problem-solving skills. And the lessons aren't just static, they are there for every level, so you can keep climbing the ladder and going to more and more complex topics. It's extremely rewarding. So if that sounds interesting to you and you want to try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, you can visit brilliant.org/quizlazygeek, scan the QR code on screen, or you can click on the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Okay, and so now we've seen how our simple telescope works to focus the light on the sensor. So now we can look at things like focal reducer. So I've increased a little bit the focal length here, and I'm going to add an additional lens that is going to focus the light. So you see, I've kept 3 of our stars. I've added here a lens that acts as a focal reducer effectively. And what it does is it sharpens the angle of the light rays so they hit the sensor, and you can see the 3 stars, 1, 2, 3, are much closer to one another than they would be without the focal reducer. So indeed, because they are much closer, we have zoomed out and we cover more field of view at the same time. If I were to remove that focal reducer, now these stars focus further away, but they also are further apart from one another, so we are zooming in more. A focal extender would do exactly the opposite. So you can see this focal extender is now taking those light rays and it is using them to create a more shallow angle. And now, if I place my sensor here, I still have access to all of those 3 stars, but they are much further apart from one another. Therefore, we have zoomed into our field of view. Okay, so what about a lens hood? Let's say that in front of my lens, I have a lens hood. This lens, for instance, this photographic lens has an integrated lens hood within it. I can extend it or retract it. What happens if my lens hood is too large? So let's add a line that blocks light and start it at the edge of our lens. And we're adding here a lens hood that is blocking some of our rays of light. So you can see that it looks like all of the 3 stars will still be visible, but we have cut off some light rays, right? We've covered light rays from this star here. And if I increase the size of my lens hood even more, you can see that the stars at an angle are cut off even more, but not sufficiently to really hide them. They're still visible, but because we've cut off a few of those light rays, they are less bright on the sensor than they were just a moment ago. If I add the light rays from a star that is even further afield with this particular lens hood, that 4th star is completely blocked. So you can see if I remove the lens hoods, I have my 4th star that appears on the sensor here. If I add the lens hood back in front of the lens here, suddenly we don't have that star at all. And this explains effectively vignetting, or some of the vignetting that we can experience with lens hoods. If your lens hood is too long, it can cause loss of light towards the edge of your field of view. that is the vignetting, and you can see it in action here, where I lose and regain my light rays as I extend and retract the dew shield. Okay, so now that we've seen how it works with a perfect lens, let's have a quick look at how it works with a non-perfect lens. So here we have a glass lens that is modeled by this software, but is not perfect. And we have light rays from a star far away that are hitting that lens at a 90-degree angle. And you can see that the focus point is here actually. So I would place my, my sensor roughly at this point. But you can see we have light rays that are not focused directly on the star either. We have a very strong point of light at the center, but then we have light rays that are also like around the star. So we have like a whole halo of light. So a disc, halo-ish disc of light around the dot of super concentrated light that is the star itself. And if I add a second star with its light rays coming from another direction, so a second star in the field of view, it also will get focused more or less on the sensor. But you can see the halo around that single dot of light at the center will be asymmetrical. It is more concentrated above the star and less concentrated but longer below the star. So we can see that this lens is far from being perfect / ideal. And it's one of the reasons why for astrophotography, we look for lenses that are made in specific materials that will focus light better, focus multiple wavelengths, colors of light better on the same spots. Will also create doublets and triplets. This lens that I have here, by the way, you can see a line there. This is actually because it's made of two lenses attached to one another. This is called a doublet lens. And we do that to try and counteract the imperfections in our lenses by having multiple designs and combination of lenses to help with that. There's another simple way to help with that is what happens if I take this configuration here and I add a blocker, an aperture mask. I reduce the aperture of my lens. Look at the huge difference that this makes. We have closed off the aperture on the lens, and now we have much sharper stars on our sensor. This is because we are now avoiding the parts of the lens where a lot of the aberrations come from. And at the same time, the cost is that we are capturing far fewer light rays than otherwise. So we are losing light, but we are gaining sharpness. That's exactly what you do when you close the aperture of a normal lens and you notice that your picture is now sharper. This is because we are able to avoid a lot of those aberrations. Okay, I want to look at a couple of other telescope designs, something like a Newtonian telescope type of design, as well as more or less a classical Cassegrain type of design to show you how this works. But before we do that, please be sure to leave a like on the video if you find it instructive. You can also leave a comment with your opinion, something else you want me to cover, that kind of stuff. I love all of your comments. I read all of them and I try to respond to a lot of them. And if you want to help the channel even more and you're planning on buying anything from Agena, High Point Scientific, First Light Optics, Amazon, etc., if you do so after clicking the links that I have down in the description, it will help me out at no cost to you. And if you want to help even more directly the channel, you can become a Patreon member. The link is down in the description, or you can become a channel member, which is the join button next to the subscribe button. This helps the channel directly and it helps me produce those videos. So thank you so much, guys, for your generosity. Of course, if you're new to the channel and you like this kind of video, you may consider subscribing using that little subscribe button. Okay, with that, let's go back to our designs. Let's start with the Newtonian. This time the Newtonian, I don't have a lens here. This is actually an ideal curved mirror that's more or less f4, a focal ratio of f4. And you can see I have a second mirror here, which is just a flat mirror. And you can see we have our light rays coming from a single star here. They go onto our secondary mirror. They go into the primary mirror. They get focused towards the secondary mirror. And then the secondary mirror takes those light rays and places them outside of the telescope where I can place my camera, and we have a star that is focused in the field of view. We can add a second star very easily. Here I have a star with light rays coming from a second direction, and look at what's happening. We are focusing all of those light rays on the second point in the sensor. We're doing exactly what we've been talking about the whole time. I can reduce the focal length, and you can see that suddenly those two stars, I would need to put my sensor inside the telescope, which doesn't work, but you can see that they are closer to one another, so we have zoomed out. If instead I increase the focal length of my primary mirror, now I need to place the sensor further apart, further afield, and we are getting our two stars, but they are further apart from one another, so we have zoomed in. Effectively, it's exactly the same thing that is happening as with the lens, it's just that the design is different, but the principle is exactly the same. We can also look at something like more or less a classical Cassegrain telescope, where we have here a main ideal curved mirror, which is an f2 mirror in this case. And we have a secondary mirror that's actually also curved, but it is, the secondary mirror here is a slightly convex mirror basically, and it helps to get those light rays that are coming at a steep angle. It shallows out the angle and then projects it towards the back of the telescope. We will need to open up a hole here at the back of the telescope. I cannot really with this software, because the mirror cannot have a hole in the center with this particular piece of software. But if I were to extend the light rays, you can see that they get focused around here. And we can also have a view, by the way, where we see images formed, and we get a dot here for where the star would actually get formed. If we add a second star at a slight angle from the first one, here we go. We can see that now, if I look at the extended light rays, we have those light rays crossing one another at two different spots. If I have a proper hole at the back of my telescope and I place my sensor here, I will be able to form images of those two stars. And I can even add a third star that is even further apart from the other two. Here it is, another beam of parallel light rays, and we can see we have even more light rays, and we can see those gray things. 1, 2, and 3 stars. If I put my sensor here, I'll be able to see all of those 3 stars on the sensor, assuming, of course, we have the hole at the back of the telescope to let the light through. Now, I've also created underneath a second telescope that has the exact same primary mirror and the exact same 3 stars with the exact same angles, except that now, instead of forming an image behind the telescope here, we are forming an image directly at the main focal plane of the primary mirror. This is exactly what you would do if you're using something like a Hyperstar lens on a Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope. The Hyperstar lens is not a focal reducer, it's just a field flattener. It's there to correct the aberrations of the primary mirror, basically, and then project the image onto your camera sensor. And here, because I'm using an ideal mirror, I don't need my Hyperstar lens. I can just see what's going to happen. We have a star at the center of the field of view. It immediately, like you can see, it focuses the light directly onto my sensor here. If I add the second star, which is exactly the same angle as the one above, you can see it also gets focused, but it's focused almost at the same point. We can see a slight separation between those two stars. So we are indeed, compared to having focused the light at the back of the telescope, we are now really like zooming out quite a lot on this particular telescope. And then it is the third star, and the same story. We can see that there's some separation between the 3 stars on our camera sensor, but we are really zooming out a lot. And that's one of the power of Hyperstar, is the ability to give you access with your Schmidt-Cassegrain to a much wider field of view, meaning you can capture those light rays from stars that come in at a steeper angle compared to the 90 degrees straight on angle of something that you have in the center of the field of view. So Hyperstar is not like a hype thing that is useless. It actually has a job, which is to extend your field of view, and then you can make use of more of the light that your telescope has let in, simply by virtue of having a larger field of view, but this is at the cost of resolution. And by the way, going back quickly to the Newtonian one, what happens to an out-of-focus image with a Newtonian telescope? Well, if I place my sensor towards the back here, you can see that those two stars, they're no longer disks when they're out of focus. They're disks, but with a hole in the center, which is the shadow of the secondary mirror, effectively. And that's why, with a Newtonian telescope, or also, if we go back to the Schmidt Cassegrain, if my sensor was not placed here, but like around here or around there, we can see that the light becomes effectively a donut shape rather than just a disc shape as we had with the original lens. One more thing to look at with focus is how it depends on the focal length. If we have a short focal length, let's say 200 millimeters, and I take my, my sensor, if I move my sensor out of focus by a little bit, immediately those star shapes are really large disks on my sensor. If, on the other side of things, I have a much longer focal length, let's say 600, and now I have my sensor here, if I move it by roughly the same distance, you can see the stars are still much smaller on my sensor, much smaller disks on my sensor than they were earlier. We are less out of focus. And that depends actually both on the focal length, but also the aperture. Because if I add an aperture here in the center, you can see that even though I'm slightly out of focus, the stars are almost like dots on my sensor. If I open up the aperture again, you can see the stars are more like disks. And that's where like the shallow depth of field comes from, as a combination of both the physical aperture of the lens that is being used and the focal length. You can get out of focus faster, and so getting to critical focus requires more precision when your focal length is short and when your aperture is large. And with that, I think that covers it all. Again, please like the video if you like this kind of educational video. Leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think of all of that. Has this cleared up misconceptions for you? Are there points you don't understand and want me to cover? If you want to support this channel even more, and you're planning on buying anything from Agena, High Point, Amazon, etc., if you do so after clicking the links that I have in the description, it will help me out at no cost to you. If you want to help more directly, you can join my Patreon. Link is in the description. You can join the channel as a member, and we will have the credits for my Patreon supporters and channel members at the end of this video. With that, I hope you learned something. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget, whenever you can, to look up at the stars with your tiny telescopes, and I'll see you next time.